For today's episode, we will cover autism and communication disorders. These are a few, 4, 5, or 6 disorders right before the autism section of the DSM-5 TR. These are heavily involved with speech and language abilities. We will cover the brain regions, connectivity, brainwave patterns, how they are measured, longitudinal studies, and a rare region of interest for the podcast, interventions. I don't love it, but some genetics as well. We will mostly cover this as part of expanding on the autism and speech and language episode from the spring, and last week's Decoding the Brain, how reading works in autism and dyslexia. We are kind of piecing this together because this is all in play here as well. Mostly, we are talking about criteria A, the abnormalities in social communication and interaction of the autistic phenotype, criteria A. These are things like language abilities, nonverbal communication, starting and stopping conversation, understanding sarcasm, and even maintaining conversational flow. All pretty much challenges for the autistic phenotype. For social or pragmatic communication disorder, this is SCD. This is kind of pragmatic problems. 50 to 70% of individuals with autism show pragmatic deficits that resembles social pragmatic communication disorder. However, these cannot coexist. You should never have a co-diagnosis of autism and social communication disorder, sometimes called pragmatic disorder. Here's a wide range. 4 to 22% experience childhood onset fluency disorder. Now previously, this was just called stuttering. In the DSM-5, they think they're being kind of kind now, I guess. I don't know. Child onset fluency disorder with stuttering highlighted. 20 to 30% have speech sound disorder, and up to 50% meet criteria for developmental language disorder. So those are the 4. Social communication disorder, or pragmatic, child onset fluency disorder, or stuttering, speech sound disorder, and developmental language disorder. These overlaps stem from disruptions in shared neural circuits, particularly those involved in language processing and motor control and social cognition, modulated by some genetic factors. And here are the 2 that we're going to kind of spend most of the time on. FOXP2, and one you might recognize if you listen to the podcast, as it's been mentioned several different times, and even with Dr. Hannah Stevens. CNTNAP2. These specific comorbidities are crucial for developing targeted interventions that address both the autistic phenotype and these other communication style disorders. So here are some shared neural features, some brain regions involved in pretty much all of these. And they're very popular. If you listen to the podcast, these are very popular. The medial prefrontal cortex, which is one of my favorites. Temporal parietal junction. We've talked about that in several episodes, both of those regions actually. The superior temporal sulcus. Remember that from the Decoding the Brain episode on reading. These 3 are critical for social cognition and a so-called theory of mind, which is kind of incomplete. The ability to understand others' perspectives and intentions are what we basically are talking about. In the autistic phenotype, these regions consistently show hypoactivation during tasks requiring social understanding, such as interpreting facial expressions or conversational context. leading to difficulties in social communication. Some examples for you. When individuals with autism process social cues, fMRI studies reveal reduced activity in the right temporal parietal junction, which is essential for perspective taking. The so-called mirror neuron system. Now, mirror neurons are kind of hit or miss, but I think for this topic it's kind of important to mention. These are located in the inferior frontal gyrus. Remember last week's episode on decoding the brain. This includes Broca, so it's huge for language processing. And also the inferior parietal lobe. This is responsible for imitating actions and understanding others' intentions. So hard stop. I just really want to mention this. The benefit of the autistic phenotype is to be our own person, not to be influenced or caught up or care even about what other people are doing. That is not that bad of a thing. Our so-called internal state, remember the definition or translation of autism, is self. It's very entertaining and intense with these imaginations and visual thinking, whereas the outside world is one very chaotic. Remember the sensory processing episodes in those so-called heightened states, hyper, brainwaves, staying in gamma. The outside world is complicated. And most of the time, it's not as interesting, just quite frank. In the autistic phenotype, these so-called mirror neurons exhibit reduced activation during tasks like observing gestures, contributing to deficits in social interaction and communication. The cerebellum is also involved. Remember Dr. Reza Shadmir, particularly in the cerebellum, the vermis. This plays a role in motor coordination and speech porosity, maybe, which is melodic lines of speech, such as the frequency, the intensity, and duration of the spoken word, pitch, volume, pace, and rhythm. Think monotone is not that. The autistic phenotype, there's plenty of impressive data here. And remember our guest, Dr. Shadmir, sharing information here. Such a great episode. He's such a great human being. Shows reduced Purkinje cell density. This is very, very common and leads to atypical speech patterns, such as monotone or irregular porosity. These tongue movements, too. These are reduced. Some shared functional and structural connectivity. The autism phenotype is characterized by disrupted connectivity patterns that affect communication and social processing. Functional connectivity assessed through resting state, fMRI, reveals underconnectivity in long-range networks, such as those linking frontal to temporal regions. Remember, these are extremely distal. We could probably spend every episode talking about distal connections. Even remember Dr. Richard Fry talking about leucovorin. Leucovorin rescues these distal connections. It's one of the things that is helping with the autistic phenotype, especially the nonverbals. This is a very interesting product, and I'm glad it's taking place and getting some highlights here now with the administration saying this should be a treatment option. Leucovorin. See the episode with Dr. Richard Fry from the spring. Those poor distal connections that are underconnected, they have a hard time keeping up with sensory processing and kind of orchestrating different movements and understanding of the social world. Local circuits, such as those within the occipital or temporal regions, often show overconnectivity. Remember, we've talked about this quite in detail with the sensory processing episode and the decoding the brain episode. We won't have to go into this, but that diffusion tensor imaging is wild. The data here are so wild. Remember the arcuate fasciculus. Here's a new one, the superior longitudinal fasciculus, SLF, and this supports social and executive functions. So this is huge here. And also lower fractional anisotropy, again, remember it's measuring water, indicates compromised fiber integrity that correlates with language and social deficits. So there's a new fasciculi. We have many different fasciculi. The arcuate fasciculi, or arcuate fasciculus, is for those speech and language connections. This new superior longitudinal fasciculus, this is so-called connecting executive functioning to language. So it's also including language, mainly in the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. Now, if you're a lumper, you will combine the arcuate fasciculi into this superior longitudinal fasciculus. Now, some people say that arcuate is just a part of this SLF. That's a lumper. They lump regions together. If you are a splitter, you will split the arcuate fasciculus and the superior longitudinal fasciculus apart into two distinct fasciculi. So brainwave patterns. Brainwaves measured through EEG and MEG provides insight into the temporal dynamics of neural activity in the autistic phenotype. Temporal, not meaning the temporal lobe, but time, the time component here. Reduced gamma band, 30 Hertz to 80 Hertz, is synchrony as a hallmark of autistic phenotype, so a reduced gamma band, and this reflects impaired local processing and sensory integration, particularly in frontal and temporal regions. This reduction is evident during tasks requiring attention to social stimuli, such as processing faces or voices. Once again, the study on 6-week-old humans from UCLA showing that different connection from the salient network. The salient network with these younger autistic subjects in this study. Now, they later tracked them to indicate, yes, autism, no, not autism. The autistic ones had different connections of the salient network. That's insula to the sensory motor compared to the typicals, insula to the frontal cortex. This is all in play here. This is all connected. In addition, atypical alpha band, so remember the 8 to 12 hertz, suppression, alpha band suppression, which typically occurs during attentional task, suggests deficits in modulating attention to relevant stimuli. And this contributes to social and communication challenges. However, increased theta band, 4 to 8 hertz, increased theta band power in frontal regions indicates compensatory effort as the brain attempts to overcome processing deficits during complex tasks like language comprehension. So it's trying to rescue itself in these frontal areas, but it's having a hard time keeping up. A measurement technique. A range of neural imaging and electrophysiological tools are used to study autism's neural profile. Task-based fMRI indicates regional hypoactivation. For instance here, in the medial prefrontal cortex or that temporal parietal junction during social and language task, while resting state fMRI quantifies connectivity disruptions in networks like the default mode network. The resting state fMRI is what the UCLA study used on 6-week-old. EEG measures event-related potentials, You might recognize that from the sensory processing part 2 episode. This is such as N400, which is reduced in the autistic phenotype during semantic or pragmatic processing, indicating difficulties with context integration. MEGs provides high temporal resolution to detect abnormal gamma and beta coherence, reflecting abnormal neural synchrony. DTIs quantifies white matter integrity through the FA, diffusion, tensor image. Remember, diffusion is nerd speak for movement. It's measuring water. And the arcuate fasciculus is abnormal here. It's very underconnected. Okay, some genetic contributions. The FOXP2 and CNTNAP2. I don't love it. It's not my role to love it, just convey it. I don't love the genetic stuff though. It seems like a dead end with the autism research. It's very suspicious. It's very, even perhaps nefarious. FOXP2 and CNTNAP2 genes are pivotal, though, in shaping the neural circuits underlying the autistic phenotype and its comorbid speech and language disorders. So this is why these are kind of a region of interest for us. And this influences language, motor, and social processing. FOXP2 is a transcription factor that regulates genes critical for neural development, particularly in regions like the inferior frontal gyrus, and a favorite of mine, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum, which are essential for language production and motor coordination. By modulating synaptic plasticity and dendritic growth, FOXP2 ensures the formation of robust neural connections, make it necessary for articulating speech and complex language processing. So, pretty important there. Sounds like a region of interest for us. Mutations in the FOXP2 disrupt articulation in the speech sound disorder and synaptic processing and the delayed language disorder and speech planning and stuttering. In the autistic phenotype, FOXP2 variants contribute to language delays and pragmatic deficits by impairing the inferior frontal gyrus function, which is, of course, a crucial area for both the language production and social communication. Some longitudinal studies have shown that FOXP2 expression levels correlate with language development trajectories in the autistic phenotype, with lower expression associated with persistent delays in verbal communication. That's shown in a 2013 study from Molecular Autism. So here's fascinating. This is a very fascinating part here. The FOXP2 regulates downstream genes, like the CNTNAP2. So it's kind of a sequela here. If upstream is abnormal, downstream is going to be abnormal. This is a very big message, constantly repeated across the podcast in many different episodes. Upstream is always the place to go. The CNTNAP2 encodes a neurexin family protein. This is involved in cell adhesion and synaptic transmission, with high expression in frontal and temporal cortices, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum, all regions of critical interest for language and social processing. This gene regulates potassium channel clustering and myelination. No surprise. Processes that ensure efficiency and neural communication and connectivity. So the autistic phenotype and social communication disorder, the pragmatic disorder. Now remember, these don't coexist. So some overview here though between the two. Social communication disorders characterized by difficulties in the social use of language, such as maintaining conversational relevance, interpreting nonverbal cues like eye contact or gestures, or understanding non-literal language, such as metaphors and things. Now, you can see why these aren't really comorbid problems. If you have the things that I just said, and you have the repetitive restricted behaviors, the criteria B, well, you have autism. So there's a chance that you can differentiate between these two and just have the social communication disorder and not have autism. But if you have the autism and you have these conditions, well, you have autism. And it might very well be who is diagnosing you, who is assessing you for the autism. Is it somebody with clinical relevance and training or not? And that's very much a problem here in 2025. So some longitudinal studies here. The longitudinal research provides critical insights into the developmental trajectory of these two situations here, the autistic phenotype and social communication disorder. A 5-year fMRI study by Lombardo et al. In 2015 from Nature Communications, very good journal. They followed children with autism and found persistent hypoactivation in the medial prefrontal cortex and the temporal parietal junction during tasks requiring pragmatic understanding, such as interpreting irony. Yeah, good luck with that. This hypoactivation correlated with social communication disorder like deficits and CNTNAP2 risk Ls, predicting worse social communication outcomes over the time. The study also showed slower maturation of the default mode network. Now, if you remember the temporal parietal junction, and if you remember the Autism and Default Mode Network episode, that's probably your connection there. And the study also showed reduced fractional anisotropy in the superior longitudinal fasciculi, and this persisted into adolescence. But early social skills interventions, such as structured social training, improved default mode connectivity in some children, suggesting neuroplasticity and the potential for targeted interventions to mitigate deficits. So some personalized interventions, more specifically, will help improve this connectivity between the medial prefrontal cortex and the temporal parietal junction for social skills development. These programs teach explicit social rules, such as how to initiate and maintain conversations. Which, if you want improvement in this area, there are options here. If you want improvement in this area, repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation targeting the medial prefrontal cortex shows promise in improving social communication by modulating neural activity in social brain regions, with studies reporting improved default mode network coherence in both autistic phenotype and social communication disorders. Experimental CNTNAP2 based therapies, such as, here you go, CRISPR gene editing in animal models, aim to restore synaptic function in social circuits, offering a potential future treatment. This is done by Daniel Gershwin. Daniel Gershwin just received one of the 13 Autism New Initiative funding by the new NIH. Okay. This was done in 2011 in Cell Press, a top journal, Cell Press. These CRISPR gene studies in animal models, and even humans now, I think, is a you pick, you choose. So autism and the childhood onset fluency disorder. In other words, autism and stuttering. This is my childhood. Childhood onset fluency disorder. These are disruptions in speech fluency, such as repetitions, prolongations or blocks. Often I kind of refer to my speech as blockage. I have blockage sometimes. In the podcast, I can just redo it. In real life, I have to just kind of stick with it and hopefully it lands. Stuttering here affects 4 to 22% of the children with autistic phenotype. And this prevalence is significantly higher than the 1% observed in general population. So, what I just said is, if you have autism, it increases your chances, and it will kind of hit 4 to 22% of the children instead of 1% of the children. It's a big thing. This high comorbid rate reflects shared deficits in motor and language networks, particularly those involved in speech planning and timing, making it very critical to understand the neural overlap for effective intervention. So the basal ganglia here is heavily involved, and this includes the putamen and the caudate. Remember the 4, 5, maybe even 6 episodes from last winter of basal ganglia? The putamen and caudate are the input areas, and there's a high kind of connection with the medial prefrontal cortex and the sensory motor cortex that's kind of above and in the middle of your head. So at the top middle, that's the sensory motor area. So the basal ganglia is involved with the motor timing and coordination. And this is in large part the substantia nigra pars compacta in the midbrain. This is dopamine 1 or excitation and dopamine 2 or inhibition. The 1 dopamine is receptors 1 and 5, and those are excitation. D2 dopamine are receptors 2, 3, and 4, and these are inhibition. This is all related to orchestrating timing of motor movements. Remember, the basal ganglia is a go, no-go area. In other words, go and stop. Now, if you think about stuttering, stuttering is go, stop, go, stop, go, stop. Just trying to find a smooth connection here, and it's not happening. fMRI studies show heightened motor planning efforts. I really want to highlight the efforts part. It's trying, it's building up, it's ratcheting, but the go, no-go areas say, okay, no, okay, no, okay, no. And it's kind of disrupted there. Longitudinal studies here, a 10-year longitudinal DTI, diffusion tensor imaging study by Chang et al. In 2019 human brain mapping, followed children with autism and stuttering. They found persistent FA reductions in the arcuate fasciculus, no surprise, and the corticospinal tract. That's new. Also, though, loaded with water, that's water, which correlated with stuttering severity. Some personalized interventions here are targeting the basal ganglia and the motor circuits to improve fluency. Repetition, or repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, or RTMS, target the putamen. This modulates dopamine signaling. Reduce stuttering severity with preliminary success in autism and stuttering. Now remember the Dr. Hannah Stevens episode, and she talked about, she has a paper which led me to her, about the high density of dendrites in the dorsal striatum in the autistic phenotype. There's no pruning. It's just very dense here. Autism really highlights and increases the risk of stuttering problems. I think over time, practice and so forth, just having the chance for our connections and brains to kind of clean up and clear out these deficits help. So over time, hopefully you have some improvements in stuttering. That intense blockage, you can feel it. You can feel it in your neck, even in the back of the head. You can just feel that blockage. Okay, autism and speech sound disorder. This is a thing, speech sound disorder. This involves difficulties with producing speech sounds accurately, leading to an articulation or phonological error. This involves Broca's area, or the left inferior frontal gyrus, and the superior temporal gyrus. Remember last time with the decoding the brain and reading. A lot of these brain regions are shared from that episode. Longitudinal studies, a 7-year longitudinal fMRI study by Redclay et al., 2018 Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience, followed children with autism and speech sound disorder, finding persistent hypoactivation in the inferior frontal gyrus and the superior temporal gyrus during articulation task. This is correlating with speech sound errors. Once again, reduced FA in the articulate fasciculus was also observed. And these variants in the FOXP2 and CNTNAP variants predicted poorer outcomes with speech therapy. However, early speech therapy initiated before the age of 6 improved FA in the arcuate fasciculus and articulation accuracy in some children, highlighting the potential for early intervention to enhance neural connectivity and speech outcomes. Most autistics are hopefully getting some sort of speech therapy. I remember in the 1980s getting some, and this is even rare in the 1980s, the small group reading interventions. Remember a previous episode, I was put in small groups in the 1980s, elementary school. And the groups were like maybe 4 or 5, with Miss Blasey was the teacher's aide. I was the slowest of the slow. A so-called task-based fMRI reveals reduced inferior frontal gyrus and superior temporal gyrus activation during articulating task, while resting state fMRI confirms auditory, motor, underconnectivity. EEG measures the P1, N1, P2 complex, which is reduced in response to speech sounds. This indicates impaired auditory processing. We'll have a future episode on autism and auditory processing. MEGs detect decreased gamma band power in the superior temporal gyrus during speech perception task, and DTI quantifies lower FA in the arcuate fasciculus. This was shown way back in 2003 in Annuals of New York Academy of Sciences by Ledlow and Laux. There's a specific articulation-focused therapy called prompts for restructuring oral, muscular, photonic targets, or PROMPT for short. This is tailored to autistic phenotype sensory sensitivities and improves the inferior frontal gyrus, superior temporal gyrus connectivity. And this is shown through post-intervention fMRIs. This was highlighted in Morgan et al. In 2018 of Journal of Speech, Language, and Hearing Research. So PROMPT. And these therapies use tactile cues to guide articulation movements and enhancing speech accuracy. RTMS targeting the left inferior frontal gyrus enhances phonological processing by stimulating neural activity in language areas, with preliminary successes in the autistic phenotype and speech sound disorders. EEG-based neural feedback targets gamma band power in the superior temporal gyrus improves speech sound perception by training the brain to enhance auditory processing. That kind of sounds complicated, but it is an option. So, the autistic phenotype and speech sound disorders kind of highlight articulation errors. Okay, and lastly, autism and developmental language disorder, DLD. DLD is characterized by persistent difficulties in language comprehension or production, affecting vocabulary, grammar, or discourse. And this affects up to 50% of children with autism. This high comorbidity rate reflects significant overlap in language networks, making it a critical area for understanding communication challenges in the autistic phenotype. Some neural networks include dysfunction in the Broca's area and Wernicke's area. This is critical for syntax and language comprehension. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is also affected here, impairing executive aspects of language, such as planning complex sentences. Cerebellar abnormalities in both disorders disrupt porosity and language timing, contributing to atypical speech patterns. The autistic phenotype's broader sensory and social deficits, involving regions like the medial prefrontal cortex and occipital cortex, accelerate developmental language disorders, language-specific impairments. This creates a more complex communication profile whenever they coexist. Longitudinal studies show a 12-year longitudinal DTI study in the Journal of Neurodevelopmental Disorders. And this followed children with both autism and developmental language disorder, finding persistent FA reductions in the arcuate fasciculus, correlating with severe language delays. CNTNAP2 variants predicted poorer outcomes, with effects persisting into adolescence. Early language therapy, initiated before the age of 5, improved FA in the arcuate fasciculus and language outcomes in some children. It's easy for me to say, and you don't have to hear, that early intervention, especially with speech language, is very beneficial. Earlier, the better. Task-based fMRI reveals reduced inferior frontal gyrus and superior temporal gyrus activation during sentence processing tasks, while resting state fMRI confirms language network underconnectivity. EEG measures delayed N400, so remember, roughly 400 milliseconds, responses during semantic task, indicating comprehension deficits. This is well aligning with the data and coverage of Decoding the Brain, Reading and Autism and Dyslexia episode. This fits the timing. MEG deficits detect reduced gamma band power in the inferior frontal gyrus and the superior temporal gyrus during language task. DTI quantifies lower FA in the arcuate fasciculus, with even more severe reductions in the autistic phenotype plus developmental delayed disorder. So some personalized interventions for these two. Syntax-focused therapies, such as narrative-based interventions, are tailored to the autistic phenotype's sensory and social deficits, improving the IFG, inferior frontal gyrus, and the superior temporal gyrus connectivity, as shown by post-intervention fMRI, and 2016 Autism. These therapies focused on building grammatical skills through storytelling, which engages both language and social circuits. RTMS targeting the left Broca area enhances syntactic processing by stimulating neural activity in language areas, with preliminary success in the autistic phenotype and developmental learning disorder comorbid condition. EEG-based neural feedback targeting gamma band power in language areas improves comprehension by training the brain to enhance processing efficiency. This goes in line with that delayed processing in the downstream connections. Earlier, it's heightened, but downstream, that arrival point from point A to point B, there are 5 steps. Those last steps are going to be underconnected and delayed. However, some things are really significant here. Earlier the intervention, the better. And kind of pinpointing which problems are consistent with that autistic phenotype, with that individual. What kind of additional speech-language communication problems is the autistic phenotype having? And remember, earlier intervention, the better. If you're listening to the podcast, listening to the episode, please feel free to leave a review or rating. In podcasting, reviews, ratings, and downloads are huge, and I very much appreciate your feedback. You can contact me on X at RPS47586. We can have discussions about autism. I always appreciate your discussions about autism. You can check out the YouTube channel for all full-length shorts and clip videos. You can email me info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. And thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast.